That seam between public safety, public health, housing, and human services is key. And it's showing up on Aurora. It's showing up on Aurora with the sex trade and the inability of us to take action.
Well, that's the Seattle City Council's Public Safety Committee Chair, Councilmember Bob Kettle, talking about the frustration he and many other city leaders are feeling with regard to an increase in gun violence on Aurora Avenue North. What's the next move for the council, the mayor, and the Seattle Police Department there? Also, there's a new push to save Ballard Light Rail. Where's that going to go? Or stop, I guess you'd say, plus a request for the city to declare a state of emergency with regard to transgender people moving to Seattle. A broad swath of topics this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, got a question for you here. I just saw the news that the state ferry system is now allowing pets on board. This is on vehicle decks, outdoor passenger areas, not in the galley, not around passenger seating. You are a frequent rider on the ferry. Have you seen this in action? How's this going to work out? What are your thoughts?
I thought that was already the policy. I guess.
Okay.
Because I've seen people with animals on the car deck and on the rooftop deck. I've even seen people with animals just in the booths too. So wow. I didn't know that was a change.
All right. It's a seamless transition is what I'm hearing here. That's great. Yeah. That's great. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you, David. Thanks to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our patron, Susie. Thank you so much for reaching out last week. Please do keep in touch. If you want to be one of the cool kids and be a patron of this show, well, here's how you can make it happen. Go to Patreon. Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Pledge to help out at $5 per month or more. You'll gain access to Patrons First podcast, even get an awesome decal in the process. So check it out, Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon, and support the show. A shout out to Converge Media. The video version of the show is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. Also, a big shout out to our show sponsor, Phillips Law Firm. With an auto accident, you need more than an attorney. You need someone who knows your community. We're talking about Phillips Law Firm. Their attorneys are your neighbors. Here to help. Call 1-800-JUSTICE or visit justiceforyou.com. Phillips Law Firm, unleashing justice for you. All right, let's light this candle. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, public safety, our top story this week, as the city of Seattle tries to respond to a rash of gun violence in Seattle, specifically in North Seattle. One incident happened near North 100th Street around Burgermaster. If you're familiar with the neighborhood there, this was early Friday morning of last week. The shooting involved more than 24 rounds fired across Aurora. More gun activity reported Saturday as well. The mayor's office is promising increased police emphasis patrols, but many on the council, including Councilmember Kettle, whom we heard from at the top of the show, are pointing out the factoids like, hey, the city has 29% fewer officers than it did in 2020. We don't have the officers to even cover this area enough. David, I want to talk about the city's response, what you make of that, and then this impossible question we always try to wrestle with. What impact will these actions from the city have?
Yeah, I mean, surging police presence to a hotspot area is a tried and true technique. It tends to have an effect in the immediate days and weeks after the surge takes place. But then after that, it's sort of a question of what you fill the vacuum with, because eventually you're going to have to move officers back to other duties. You know, there's probably going to be a certain level of outreach. It's not like that isn't done already by LEAD, and I think at this point now CARE too. You know, it's tough to say because Aurora, of course, has always been a difficulty. It will be interesting to see, because, you know, the SOAP law, the Stay Out of Area Prostitution law that the last council passed, is still on the books. There hasn't been a repeal here. The city attorney, Erica Evans, said that she didn't support that law, nor the downtown drug law as well. And, you know, Mayor Wilson has spoken skeptically about that as well. It'll be interesting, though, if things get really bad, if that is exercised a little bit more. You know, I think to the extent that that is a useful tool, it's kind of, in some ways, creates a pretext for officers to get more involved in people kind of loitering around that area.
Which some neighbors would say, great, let's bring it on.
Which some neighbors would say, great, for sure, yeah. Other people, anytime you use the word pretext, that kind of sends up hairs on people's back of people's necks. Yeah. So, and there are not a lot of options here, because if there were a million officers, you could deploy them all and keep them there 24/7. Sort of, there's a lot more officer presence, say, on like 3rd Avenue, for example. You could do something like that there, but there's not a huge menu of options to have a long-term answer to the area, which a lot of people have been calling for a long time.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about this ramping up security for the World Cup later in the show. But I heard a few public commenters from the Aurora neighborhood say they're really worried about these FIFA games that are coming up here in Seattle, coming up in June and July, could make the Aurora situation even worse, because this prostitution that we're talking about that happens there has been happening there for decades. That could increase, these neighbors say. The crime that goes along with prostitution could increase too. What do you make of this connection between World Cup safety along Aurora Avenue North? Some thoughts on that, please.
You hear that a lot around major events. That always comes up during the Super Bowl. Concerns about basically sex tourism following major events.
Human trafficking too gets put out there for sure.
And human traffic, and then if pimps or whoever kind of anticipating that, ramping up human trafficking activity. I hear that a lot. I have heard those concerns. I don't know, and I'm not trying to cast doubt here. I just genuinely don't know the data behind that to say whether or not that kind of activity does actually follow these major events. Of course, Aurora is I think a lot of the city's efforts, and we'll talk about it more around preparing for FIFA, has to do with Pioneer Square downtown or stadiums. It'll be interesting. I think this came up in the council meeting, balancing the amount of overtime that they are able to use to protect against any sort of unpredicted attacks or whatever it might be around FIFA, and how you balance that with surge presence in a place like Aurora.
It's a big issue to juggle, I know, for the SPD and the city of Seattle. So, again, we're going to be seeing this playing out in real time over the next couple of weeks as FIFA comes to town and these matches get started. Thanks for that, David. I did want to talk about also in the news this week a final announcement. I believe it's the final announcement from Sound Transit about the Ballard West Seattle expansion project for light rail. That announcement coming right at about the same time we're going to be releasing this podcast on Wednesday. As we have reported on the show, Sound Transit has said the line won't make it to Ballard. As the finances stand right now, they're more than $30 billion in the hole. But Seattle City Council member Dan Strauss, who serves on the Sound Transit board, says he has 3 amendments to the Sound Transit decision that might help out. He wants to prioritize building the Ballard line over building a second downtown tunnel in Seattle. He's also talking about increasing Sound Transit's bonding capacity so it could take out more loans potentially to get the money it needs to get this project done. He also wants a timeline for when trains would actually get to Ballard, a long-lasting point of frustration there. David, where do you want to start? Some thoughts about what Councilmember Strauss is trying to do here?
Yeah, I think on the timeline piece, in some ways, he's kind of trying to call the bluff of the language being used in Sound Transit around the Ballard line. There's a lot of words like deferred or pause or whatever. Right. And I think there is a feeling that what officials are actually saying is that has been canceled because there is no funding plan to back up that deferral. There's no way of financing it if you pause it right now. I think by demanding a timeline, it kind of forces Sound Transit to either acknowledge that they're essentially canceling this part of the line or create some benchmark for accountability into the future. The downtown tunnel piece is interesting to me. I don't know what that would mean for finances, how much you could save by prioritizing. His argument is, and as somebody who isn't as closely involved in Sound Transit as maybe I used to be, his argument is the second downtown tunnel that is planned for the West Seattle to Ballard line serves areas that are already served by the current light rail. And so, instead of building that second tunnel, we should focus on the areas that are not served by getting the train from Seattle Center out to Ballard. Yep. I'm no engineer. I don't know what that means for feasibility, how easy it is to plug in, kind of take the current tunnel and continue to extend it to Seattle Center and then Ballard and beyond. I don't know how that all works.
Yeah, just take a left. I'm sure it'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly. And then, the bonding piece, that one's tough because they went to the legislature and asked the legislature to do 75-year bonds, which would at least give them a little flexibility. It doesn't really answer the broader question completely, but it opens up some flexibility, at least in the current moment. But it didn't get anywhere. I don't know what the prospects are for next session, but that's not something that you can just unilaterally do. He's calling for using up more of the current legal debt capacity of Sound Transit. That once you get to a point where you're spending more and more money servicing debt, eventually that bill would come due as well. Probably the more broad point he's trying to make here is Ballard would be the highest ridership piece of this big line, and it's about to get cut. And so I don't know that he would necessarily argue these are perfect fixes, but he is the only one who is really going hard after saving the Ballard portion of this line, and they're just in a way that there just hasn't been momentum for among other members on the board.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that one. It's that bonding capacity issue is really tough, and I think I hear what you're saying. There's, I guess, some pros to it. You could, if it were to happen, if the state allowed that to happen, et cetera, you could build this thing more quickly, I imagine, to try to get those dollars injected there. But yeah, just paying off that debt would be huge. I guess last touch on this, is this going to work? Kind of, it feels like a last ditch effort from Strauss here. What impact do you think that's going to have?
I don't know. I think the most concrete one he's offering, the one that feels the most real to me, is the ditch the downtown tunnel, the second downtown tunnel in favor of Ballard. I don't know. That makes some logical sense to me as a dummy here, but maybe there are some complexities about this that I don't entirely understand. So the feasibility of that and what that means as far as dollars and cents goes, I think would inform, what kind of the environmental impact statement of that particular proposal is, would really inform whether or not that's enough to save that Ballard extension. Yeah,
that is the multi-billion-dollar question there. Thanks, David. All right, well, up next, our continuing coverage of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority after a report from that agency last week laying out how it's trying to respond to the mounting concerns over its finances. That's next on Now Hear This. Well, on Friday of last week, the King County Regional Homelessness Authority put out a report outlining the steps that it's proposing to take care of the major financial problems that have hampered the agency since its inception in 2019. It is a corrective action plan of 157 pages that definitely admits to some dodgy accounting in the past, but also puts some of the blame on Seattle and King County, which set up an operating model that didn't provide a good structure, the KCRHA says, for invoicing and reimbursement, etc. It's part of the continuing question for the KCRHA. Was it a good idea to try to set this agency up away from the city, away from the county, in a way that was designed to withstand changing political winds? I spoke to KCRHA Director Dr. Kelly Kinnison about that issue and the future of the agency almost exactly a year ago on the Seattle Channel.
I see KCRHA's role long-term as being that place where you can come for the data, for recommendations, for analysis, bringing people together, administering that system so that we all know what's happening, and we can be transparent with our communities, our taxpayers, but that as we change elected leaders, we're ready to step up, work with them for their vision, for their communities.
David, I wanted to bring this up because you wrote about this recently in the Seattle Times with your colleague Stephanie Stokes. This plan to somehow insulate the KCRHA from political pressure backfired? I don't want to call the autopsy just yet. How would you put it?
Yeah, it was born out of a time when people's faith in government's ability, and politicians in particular, ability to respond to homelessness were at an all-time low. And so the thought at the time was there was a pretty broad chorus of agreement that there was, a kind of data-driven and science-based solution to homelessness that could be pursued, so long as the political fights that had marred the process were removed from the equation. That was at least thinking at the time. And thus was born the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. There was sort of two opinions that we heard about that. On the one hand, there was the thought that that vision of kind of letting the experts hash it out was actually never really fully realized. There was, politicians were given at the last minute, given more authority, given more sort of direct meddling access into how that body worked.
This is the whole idea of trying to center up people with lived experience of homelessness.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the other piece was that was always, the other argument was that was always an impossible task, that homelessness is by nature a political issue and you can't insulate politicians from that issue. And it's unpopular enough that by putting it in a place that's removed from both Seattle and King County, what you've done is basically make it forgettable and create a scapegoat that is easier to blame than the government agencies themselves.
The agencies that created it. Yeah, right.
Right, exactly. I think really for me, the biggest I mean, it sounds cliche to say that it comes down to politics and money, because everything comes down to politics and money, but that's what it is. And I think the biggest, kind of most consistent argument I heard was, this thing was supposed to be independent of those political fights, create this space where you could have really tough conversations around what needed to happen. But because it was so tied to the funding specifically of Seattle, I mean, both Seattle and King County, but really Seattle, it was never built to have any sort of outside source of funding, a push to, pass a countywide tax that the local cities could spend to buy into this agency didn't go forward. And so what you had is you had this basically separate department that was still wholly dependent on funding from the city of Seattle. And so, it was at once a philosophy that some questioned whether it was ever wise to try and remove politicians from the equation. But even those who did think that was maybe the right call say it never became that, because it was always just an extension of Seattle and King County. And so all you've done is taken the same old political fights that have always marred conversations around homelessness and moved them to an agency that was easier to ignore. And so then you have the same fights and worse accountability.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. But I know you were trying to tackle this question in your piece too there, and we've been trying to look at this over the past couple of weeks following the audit of the KCRHA. Where do we go from here when it comes to responding to homelessness in King County? Because that idea of going to the splintered type of approach, I don't think that's very popular. Any thoughts on that? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I would have said that the momentum initially was towards dissolving KCRHA. I don't know if it's quite there anymore. Question of whether or not they try to fix it or dissolve it. I think the bigger question, though, is does can and should so-called regionalism survive, which is that this is not a Seattle problem, but it is a countywide kind of region problem that needs to be tackled all together. Not everyone agrees that that's the best approach, but I would say most people do. Mm-hmm. And I think the real fear is that by dissolving King County Regional Homelessness Authority, people will see that as a defeat for regionalism more generally rather than just this one agency. And therefore, this hope that you can go back to doing things the way people used to do them and also have the level of coordination that you need is just not possible anymore. Other people argue, well, of course it's possible. You have a regional body already, and it's called the King County government.
Yeah, right.
And so we can use the thing that already exists as a coordinating body between Seattle and all the suburbs. That doesn't really answer the question of whether or not Seattle can realistically fund and work with the suburban cities, and whether, they can all get on the same page about what the best path forward for homelessness is. But, I think, again, if the Regional Homelessness Authority is saved, it will be out of a fear that by dissolving it, you have killed and you shot at regional coordination and are going to replace it with something worse rather than a ringing argument in its favor.
Yeah, no, this one is fraught. And again, more reports coming out over the next several weeks. We're supposed to get a decision by August 1st from the mayor and the county executive as to what's next, the future of the actual organization going forward. David, I want to dive back into this public safety issue and this concern over what happens when FIFA matches come to town, the World Cup, thousands of soccer fans descending on Seattle in just a couple of weeks here. A report to the Public Safety Committee this week seemed to indicate that Seattle is ready. I'm putting big air quotes around that because of this piece you brought up earlier. The discussion for the council centered on, okay, maybe we got the downtown core and Pioneer Square figured out after 2 years of planning, but what happens to other neighborhoods of Seattle, Aurora, for example, or some of these other neighborhoods where they're going to have viewing areas, etc. What were some of your takeaways from this Public Safety Committee meeting about World Cup preparedness?
Yeah, I mean, there was still some question around the size and staffing of the Office of Emergency Management. There was a report that came out in January that said, compared to other World Cup host cities,
it's not as big. Yeah,
Seattle's Emergency Management Department was not as big or well staffed, and that was a cause for concern. They're getting some money to help kind of bring that more in line with other cities, which seems to be bringing them up towards something closer to preparedness. The piece that we heard the most about in the council briefing was around the cameras in SoDo.
Yeah.
Councilmember Saka gave a big speech basically calling on Mayor Wilson to turn those cameras on because she had previously said she will keep the cameras in that area there, but will only turn them on in the event
if there's
of
a credible threat. Right.
Several members of the council now have raised the question of whether that's a wise approach, whether you can actually know or get fair warning of a credible threat. And so the pressure, I think, from the council for her to turn those on is growing, and that's kind of interesting. Councilmember Saka talked about his experiences at the Boston Marathon in 2013 when there was the bombing there. So that, that came up a lot. But, there is some outside funding and grant money for overtime for public safety and officers, but not that much. And you do still have this restriction of just the number of officers that are even out there and able to do this work. So that, I think, is the kind of the big balancing act that we're seeing right now and the big questions are around this camera system in Soto. Does that get turned on? And then how do you use the city's resources that they have wisely?
Yeah, exactly. And you brought this up earlier too, but I just wanted to touch on it again. It just so many arguments now within the council and talking about this when it comes to World Cup. Build up the police force, enforce laws like stay out of areas of prostitution, increase surveillance camera usage. Those themes, I got to say, were not popular on the campaign trail just a couple of months ago, and suddenly they're big issues again. Can you talk to me about that? Because that does seem to be a very different right now, again, with the World Cup right upon us.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think this is what happens when a mayor wins by 2,000 votes. That said, Councilmember Foster and Councilmember Lynn both, and Councilmember Rink, and City Attorney Erica Evans, they all won their races by huge margins.
Handily,
and they were talking a different tone. They were not exactly endorsing all of these approaches. I think this council is feeling like when push comes to shove, people are going to support a security state that can promise better safety over concerns about what that means for privacy. And, it's Councilmember Kettle and Councilmember Saka are both military veterans. So it's not particularly surprising that they're going to support increased official government safety presence.
Yes.
In these events. So, but yeah, I agree. It is interesting that they are speaking as forcefully as they are in favor of some issues that were not particularly popular on the campaign trail.
Yeah. It's all something you write on a piece of paper until you have however many 100,000 people start coming to town for the World Cup.
Yeah, exactly.
So another story that we're going to stay on top of here. And coming up, folks, is it time to declare a state of emergency to protect transgender people moving to Seattle as they're trying to get away from states with anti-trans laws on the books? That story coming up on What's Next? Local trans rights activists are calling on the city of Seattle and Mayor Wilson to declare a state of emergency to protect trans people who they say are moving to Seattle in droves to escape states that have anti-trans laws. There was a rally this past weekend, outside City Hall calling for more attention and more resources devoted to this. David, I think we all know that there's a lot of fear in the transgender community right now. From different accounts I've read, I've certainly seen that across the country. But at the same time, it's also hard to track exactly how many trans people have moved to Seattle because of these different laws that are going on. It just makes it a little bit of a challenge for Mayor Wilson. But I know there are some loud voices of protest calling for this.
Nor would you necessarily want the city government to be tracking the number of transgender people moving to Seattle.
Right. Good point.
Talk about information security. So, yeah, I don't know. It is. And, the stabbing of the person in the U district, I think emphasized and put some gasoline behind the calls here for the state of emergency. I think the risk of a state of emergency is you get, the same one that we saw with the homelessness state of emergency is you get trapped in something that doesn't have a clear end and clear goal. I think that's probably what Mayor Wilson is looking for is, if we're going to declare a state of emergency, that we are trying to accomplish something pretty specific here that can then be repealed. And, that's always a balancing act. If it is, a broad issue, is an emergency declaration the way to deal with that versus, is there something kind of acute happening that needs an immediate response? I don't know the answer to that. And again, I don't know that anyone who is calling for this civil state of emergency would be in support of broad data collection of the number of trans people living in Seattle and where they're coming from. That seems like that would make things even worse. If their concern is kind of security and being shielded from less friendly parts of the country. So, I frankly don't know where this goes from here and how you kind of quantify or wrap your arms around how big of an issue this is or what a civil state of emergency would do beyond, it could be seen as purely just kind of a more symbolic statement of support. And maybe that's fine. But again, a state of emergency does come with real authority and expanded authority by the government. And I think Mayor Wilson is perhaps maybe a little hesitant to put that into place without a clear timeline for ending it.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think another challenge here, it's a fundamental one. Cities declare emergencies to start the process to obtain state and federal funding as it's needed. So I'm just kind of thinking this through. If the city did declare an emergency, I could see the state maybe helping out with an investment of resources to try to help out. But there's no way Seattle will get federal support for additional spending on the trans community. You know what I mean? I'm not saying the feds shouldn't do it, of course. I'm just saying I am absolutely certain that federal officials wouldn't want to reimburse Seattle for this. That official nature of it really changes this conversation.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I don't know that you would, again, to the point of you don't want to be having a big data collection push on the number of trans people moving to Seattle. I don't know that they even want to make the ask to the federal government for money. Again, the question is Seattle being overwhelmed by something right now that it can't handle without cutting some significant red tape or opening up some new authorities to Mayor Wilson or funding avenues that didn't exist before? I don't know the answer to that. I haven't gotten any indication. And there are examples of, I think of when in Tukwila, when there was the huge number of people who were asylum seekers who were moving there. That was a pretty clear situation where a city like Tukwila was being overwhelmed by something that they could not handle. That is the sort of example of a situation where it makes some sense to have a declaration of emergency, because you're just basically saying, hey, we need help here. We need new authorities that we don't currently have. I don't know if that's the case right now exactly. So, it'd be interesting to hear the argument in favor of that. A lot still happening with that story as well. So something we'll keep track of too. But David, we do need to wrap up. I need to head back to the Mariners with you, my man. This whole idea of piggyback pitching, the Monday game of this week in particular, Luis Castillo cruising, did not give up a run over 4 innings, looked great, and he gets pulled. Bryce Miller comes in, finishes things up for the last 5 innings, and I think most importantly, Seattle gets the win, but Castillo was not happy about it at all. What do you make of this piggyback pitching plight? What do you got? Yeah, it's complicated, and I don't know that Dan Wilson is the guy that I have a lot of trust in handling this delicately. As you can tell, I'm not a big Dan Wilson fan these days. Not personally. He's a great guy. I have a lot of.
He was a catcher. He used to handle pitchers all the time.
I know, but I just, I don't have a lot of faith in him as a manager, if I'm being honest. I don't know. It's interesting. It seems maybe a little overly complicated. You've got a lot of egos here. It's more than just paper. That said, Luis Castillo has had a few instances where he looks really good a couple times through the order and then looks really bad. So I don't know. It's maybe not the worst thing to pull him before things turn bad. And they did win the game, but he's paid a lot of money to pitch, and he's certainly not happy about not pitching.
I got to that 68 pitch mark. So it was like, where are we going here? That so interesting to watch this play out. I think the reason we haven't seen a lot of this piggyback pitching thing is it does create these different ego problems like this. So that's not always healthy for a club either. But we will see. Glad they got the win, and we'll see where we go from here. David, thank you as always. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more. Thanks very much for the help. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you might tune in. Mexico and Brazil in a tie for listenership on our last episode. Muchas gracias. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.